Hey, what's good, everyone? Welcome back to the Outside the Box podcast. My name is Nick Ingval, and on this podcast, I do my best to give you some insight, exposure, and introductions into new ways of thinking about sneakers and some new, just get out of that stereotypical like go buy sneakers conversation and talk to some people that I think do some interesting things. So, I have got a guest on with me today that I'm super excited to introduce to you who wrote a book called Signature Shoes, The Athletes Who Wore Them, and Delightful Pop Culture Nuggets, which I just finished reading up over the last weekend or so. And Ryan Trembath is on with me. How you doing, Ryan?
Hey, good, Nick. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course, man, of course. So, I it took me a little while to get to the book because I was doing this big sneaker conversation,
Yeah, I
thing
saw that.
a few weeks back, and I'm actually glad I delayed it because I actually read it in one sitting, basically on a Saturday night, and a couple hours, few hours later, and got through the whole thing. And I think it was really cool the way you tied together some of the like really deep stories that exist below the surface within sneakers and sports, and also just the kind of the timeline things. But we'll get into that. But I guess the first thing is, introduce yourself and let everybody know kind of who you are and how you got into, I guess, sneakers and sports, and eventually to writing this book.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Ryan Trembath, work in television in Chicago, and I really got into this book because of the pandemic. Like it started when everything shut down, and I just didn't have anything to do. And actually, at the time, I had been reading like a few books about sneakers. And I've always been into weird, like pop culture stuff, signature items, signature shoes, of course. And then, so I actually, to get even weirder, I bought a couple typewriters, just started typing some stuff out. And um, it just became like, kind of took on its own life, really, and just became this book that, I was just having a blast writing. And so I'd work on it for like 4 hours a night, probably. And, really didn't think it would get published necessarily. I was kind of just doing it for fun, and what kept me going was like um, I knew I could eventually just upload it on Amazon as an ebook if no one wanted to publish it. And luckily, found a home for it. And yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to do was sprinkle in like pop culture stuff and just kind of, like you said, try to make it a fun read. It's not meant to be super like sophisticated or anything. So just wanted to keep it fun.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, I should show this to people since we're here, but I thought it was really cool when you reached out too because like just reading kind of the Amazon write up of it, being somebody who's into sneakers and especially more on the, I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily consider myself like an archivist of any official capacity, but that's really what I'm about is like capturing these moments that are going to go away that people we've just moved on from a lot of this stuff. And I think sports has done that in a lot of ways too, but obviously sports much more massive. You've got, to me, beautiful sites like Baseball Reference, Basketball Reference, where you can literally find any, snippet of information that you want to find from a very specific era or day or, minute if you want.
Yeah.
But I thought it was cool because two, you took an interesting approach with it that, like obviously, and you address this in first things first in the book, but being somebody from Chicago, I'm going to assume that your interest in sneakers probably had some connection to Michael Jordan in that era, but you chose not to dive right into that era of the signature shoes and went back even further, which I thought was awesome. And I also appreciate that you didn't fall completely into the kind of like, I don't know how to describe it, but like a lot of the books that come out with sneakers are very much like, here's the photo, here's like three sentences on the shoe, and
Yeah.
this was just so much more enjoyable and a break from that norm. Not that I don't appreciate that. I love a good like coffee table book that I can just flip through and things. But
That's
so
like all I
how?
read pretty much.
Yeah. So how did you get into I guess like what were your first kind of memories with sneakers and how did you kind of find interest in that?
Well, really, when I was like a really young kid, I would. I was obsessed with sneakers and pretty much like would it cost people on the street if I saw like a nice pair of sneakers there, like literally run up to them and just start like yelling like shoes, shoes, shoes. Like I could barely talk. But and then another big memory was the Jordan sixes were the first pair of Jordans I had, and I had some pumps and stuff like that, and I was always just really into sneakers, but I was always just like really rough on my sneakers, and like I have like a memory like the pumps would get worn out, and then the like orange ball over the bladder would fall off, and then you just have the black button after that.
Yep.
Um, but I no, I was like, of course, really into the Bulls, but I felt like there's just been so much written about Air Jordans that I kind of wanted to. I like obviously I had to include Air Jordans in the book,
Yeah.
but I wanted to like limit it a little bit. And in fact, I was watching The Last Dance last April. And I think it was I forget who it was. I think it was Jordan's manager says like, "Oh, you know what? You want to market him like a tennis pro or something with a shoe deal." And I was kind of and I've been working on this, and I was like, "Well, that's not necessarily true because like you know Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had a shoe. Clyde Frazier had already had a pretty major shoe at the time. So
Yeah.
there's like this whole other history that a lot of people, unless you're really into sneakers, might not be aware of. And
Yeah.
then,
Go
well,
ahead.
as far as the coffee table book is kind of concerned, like that was like sort of my goal when not my goal, but I was like, there's so many examples. I was like, I can do something like that in this. But then it just totally took on a life of itself, and there was just so much to kind of cover.
Yeah. Well, and I think like you still like hit on that to include the little photo section that you did that was kind of like, okay, here's the visuals for the people that don't know, right? That they can then go back. So many of the shoes people probably are actually familiar with, but they might not know that like,
Yeah,
the Puma Suede is a Clyde Frazier shoe, right? They probably recognize the shoe and they probably know Clyde Frazier, but they might not know that connection exists unless they're actually really into sneakers. So I think it was really nice to
yeah,
see that you kind of captured like I think this is a book that would be great for someone who's really into sneakers to learn a lot of like cool things from, but also people that aren't into sneakers. There's just a lot of stories, a lot of information, a lot of nuanced stuff around how these players even got to these points of getting a shoe deal, right? Because a
yeah,
lot of these players, you're talking about an era that anything pre-Jordan, it was a little bit riskier. It wasn't as guaranteed. It wasn't as mainstream. So you just didn't see as many. But then again, like you obviously have like dozens of examples in here, and I like as I was reading it, I was thinking, oh, there's so many good. Kept getting into different sports, different players, where I thought, oh, this is great because like each time I would be reading something, and I think, oh, like even like the Stan Smith, the kind of like the progression into or with the Robert Halle into the Stan Smith, all that stuff. Where like as a sneaker nerd guy, I'm like nerding out about it, but just thinking like those are things that I think people just reading those stories are things that they're not going to see if they just Google the Stan Smith shoe. It's going to take you a while to find that and
yeah.
actually learn that information. So
Right. I mean, I don't think Calais gets like any credit at all nowadays.
yeah,
I mean, yeah, you'd probably have to dig pretty deep to find that. But yeah, it's weird. Like you said, people know the suedes, the basket, um, and that I mean that my dad still wears that stuff. So he grew up
yeah,
in that era, and like, so I was just kind of used to seeing this stuff, and he still wears Stan Smiths like nonstop. Dead of the
that's
superstar.
awesome. Yeah, yeah. So how did were you already starting on it? I guess like the Last Dance. I'm trying to think. I guess that's basically about a year ago now, huh? So,
Yeah, I think that was
um,
in April.
yeah,
Because what happened right when everything shut down, it was like mid-March, and um, I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. So I always kind of wanted to write a book, not necessarily about sneakers, but anyway, I bought a typewriter and I was just kind of messing around and I wrote some stuff and I was just having fun with it. And I started writing about signature shoes and I was like, you know what? This is not just some like, this is not something I can even write on a typewriter. I have to switch to a computer. And it just kept growing and growing. And then, yeah, I mean, I basically wrote it in 3 months, which doesn't sound like a long time, but I was working on it like 4 hours a night, just having a blast. I mean, it was something I looked forward to doing, like get the kids to bed. All right, go downstairs, work on it from like 8 to midnight or something,
Yeah.
and it was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, I have a friend that's I have a couple friends that are big into typewriters. So I have to mention, like, if you haven't watched the California typewriter documentary, it's a really incredible like view into the world of typewriters, both like
Nice, I'll have
what
to
they
check that
were,
out.
yeah, what they were as like a, obviously a tool for writers and, everyone back in the day, but then what they've kind of become in this like new collectible world where you have, I can't remember who did it, but like, I think Tom Hanks is in it or someone like that who is like a massive collector of these like kind of like early era,
I know he's
pre-war
really,
typewriters and stuff. So
I know he's like really into it, and I remember because he was like one of the first celebrities to get uh, COVID-19, and he had like
yeah,
some typewriter in Australia, and he wrote something on it, but I knew he was into it, and I think like Eddie Vedder is actually like pretty into typewriters too.
yeah.
So,
Well, that
but
that that's go ahead.
it's insane how expensive they are. If you want to get one that works, like a really nice one, they're super expensive. And I mean, I bought
Yeah,
like uh, I think I paid like $50 for it, but it worked just fine. Like
yeah,
it's not like some antique collectible typewriter or something, you know. So
yeah. It's just kind of cool because I think there's just something special about that whole disconnecting, from the computer to do the work too, right? Like there's,
yeah,
like I still like to write a lot, and most of that stuff never goes anywhere other than a notebook for myself or a journal for myself at this point. But like it's just a good kind of like shut down the computer and get away from it. And I think that's kind of an interesting kind of way to approach even like, just it's like this book or any of those things, like hopefully we're kind of moving out of COVID at this point, but like that whole idea of like what do you do with yourself when you can't do what you normally do,
right.
um, and then like, as much as I love the computer and the internet, it's given me tons of opportunity. I also want to just disconnect from it and never be seen again on the internet too. So, but so I guess like when you started, how did you maybe walk us through the process of that? Because I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that have thought, oh, I want to write a book someday. How did you even go about like thinking about like I guess like the approach to planning it? Like, did you just start on one shoe and then, or did you start, with Chuck Taylor and, the early days of Pro Keds and stuff and just like go year
Um,
by year or?
so pretty much. I mean, so I like I said, I've been reading some books on sneakers, and I kind of noticed that like there wasn't, you know, they would mention a few signature sneakers, and but a lot of times the dates would be off between different books. So I just wanted to take a deeper look, and like the Chuck Taylor, there's all these different stories about, oh, he added the branded ankle patch or whatever.
Yeah.
So I kind of just wanted to figure it out. And so I started with Chuck Taylor and Mike and Pro-Keds. And then that's probably about the time I realized I'm going to have a hard time writing this entire thing on a typewriter.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and because I covered them and it was already like really getting long. So then I kind of just started trying to work chronologically. It wasn't always like the case, but that was my goal anyway. I kind of laid out the table of contents, kind of like in sort of an outline of how I wanted to work. But so yeah, I guess it was kind of in order. I mean, I jumped around a little bit. I just made a list of every signature shoe that I could think of. Like, the list was like way bigger because I stopped at the '90s in this book, and I went
Yeah.
my original list to like basically up to present day.
Yeah. I mean, you did a good job of like putting on the brakes though. I think like it gets so like chaotic at that point, right? Because
Yeah,
you have, you know, I think like the beauty of like the older stuff to me, and one of the things that I was fascinated about reading the book is that, like I guess like go back to that, Adidas example, right? It's like they made the shoe and it was a Robert Halle shoe, but then, he's going to retire. They needed somebody young and hip and, a star to wear it again. So it's like, if we're going to continue to make the shoe, so it becomes a Stan Smith shoe. And, primarily that shoe was successful enough for it to continue on till this day or whatever. But that's like one of the few examples of one shoe kind of being attached to two people pre Jordan, right? And then you get to
yeah,
Jordan, and there's so many nuances. There's so many like, well, is that a signature shoe? It was made just for that person, but it doesn't have their name or whatever. Like, and then the layers, because everybody wore multiple versions of their signature shoes in the '90s
yeah,
and 2000s. That it's just like, I mean, you probably would have had 5 times the size of the book if you would have continued on.
yeah. I mean, kind of. Well, the Stan Smith is one of the few examples I can think of where like two people kind of shared it. But yeah, I mean, early on, you had one shoe and that was it. There was like a couple examples, maybe with like Laver and Stase, or a couple where they might get two shoes. But then in the '90s, like after Jordan, it just became so convoluted, and there was just so many shoes. I mean, even like now, like I have a hard time telling like what's a collaboration, what's a signature shoe, like
Yeah,
like De La Soul gets like a Nike Dunk or something. That's not a signature shoe. That's, I mean, it's the same shoe. It wasn't designed for them. So it's
yeah.
just there's so many things like that where you could possibly mention it. But yeah, I kind of wanted to just keep it like the basically just the entire history, if I could, of how what led up to the Jordan and where we got to today.
What were some of like, some of your favorite stories from that you discovered, throughout, this process?
Um, so I mean, I'm not like that into soccer, and when I was researching, Pele getting his shoe, I mean, that was pretty cool because it was the first time the World Cup was broadcast around the world live, and so he came up with this deal with Puma where he'd bend down, tie his shoe, they'd zoom in on the shoe, um, and so I thought that was cool. There's other just like weird tidbits like I threw in there, like at the 1977 U.S. Open, someone getting shot in the leg during
Yeah,
McEnroe's match, which I brought up because Chris Everett's shoe came out in 1977, and that was a cool story. People love the name of stuff. Like I think I mentioned to my dad one time, I was like, "Oh, do you know there's a shoe named the Swinger?" And he's like, "Really, a Swinger?" And like, so a lot of people don't know about that shoe.
yeah.
So it's just kind of interesting that the fact that Puma came out with a shoe called the Swinger. What else?
The Namus stuff has always been really interesting to me because I think as someone who, I'm 41, almost 42 here, and I'm just far enough removed from like him as a player to like not have any real understanding of who he was off the field, right? I
Yeah,
know the like, you know, the what is it,
the
uh
Medicare supplement
yeah, the
version.
Medicare or like the shaving things that they did in the 80s, but
Yeah,
like I one of the things that I do that was I think made this even more fascinating because I collect like old magazines,
oh, nice.
specifically for like mostly just sports pop culture type things, but like try to find like sneaker relevant stuff in these magazines so I can kind of document the shoes that way pre internet, because like it's hard enough to search through the internet and find things in sneakers now because you've got you know seemingly hundreds of thousands of sites and Instagram accounts that are throwing new stuff out every day.
Right.
But to me, like having like the magazines and seeing kind of, and gives me a little bit more like, I don't know, so it just feels a little more special to me in that sense, because I'm not gonna, I have a lot of shoes and I'm thankful for that, but I don't want to like become a museum in my house full of shoes, like, you know, hunting old shoes either. I mean, I definitely have a bunch of older shoes, but like, it's just, it's easier for me to flip through the magazines and see those ads and kind of have that nostalgia, and even just the, kind of learning experience with some of those, like, especially in the 60s and 70s, where it's like, you just didn't see, like there's no way for people to even know what was going on with like footwear in that sense, right? Like even into the 80s, right? Like the Jordan stuff was kind of the, you know, I don't know, the mainstreamification of, you know, the marketing aspect of it, right? Like,
Yeah,
there was
definitely.
obviously Converse and Dr. J, and I remember those as a kid. I remember the Converse weapon commercial like vividly, because we watched basketball on Saturdays on CBS or whatever it was, and it was like that was something that like kind of stuck with me, and probably was like one of my first personal introductions into sneakers, I guess, on a bigger level. But the magazines are always interesting because like I have a few that have, some of those old Joe Namath ads where he's like surrounded by two, women and wearing his fur coats and stuff,
It's
and you're
wild.
like, is this guy's selling shoes? Like, and what I always find interesting is that it was never just a Puma ad. It was always, with Joe Namath specifically, it was always a store specific
Yeah.
ad with Joe Namath, where a lot of players seem to have, just kind of the what you would the standard. Here's your Nike shoe. Here's your Nike poster shrunk down into a magazine ad. Uh, but one of the things that I think was really fascinating, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about this. There was so much you got, I guess, so deep into the back and forth between the Dassler brothers, right, with Puma and Adidas, because there were all these. I don't know if this is making them sound bad, but it's almost like sinister characters in the way that these companies went after athletes, like the Pele story, right? How
Yeah.
did you kind of? I mean, what was that like for you, and how did you kind of get? I'm sure that was like, instantly the names start connecting as you're researching, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, it is weird, like, the sinister beginnings and their ties to the Nazi Party, which, a
Yeah.
lot of people, you don't like hear that mentioned just in everyday life, even though you see Puma and Adidas everywhere. Um,
Yep.
and then I felt like I had to dive pretty deep into their story just because they were the two companies that really started the whole trend of signature sneakers. So I had to give that backstory. Um, and I mean, there's there's a whole book on the two families basically in sneaker wars, but I felt like I had to give a pretty big background on them, just given what became later. So um, yeah, but it is weird. It's like I was just thinking about like Coca-Cola the other day. I mean, they have the guy that founded Coca-Cola. Well, one, it had cocaine in it, and two, they have ties to the Confederate Party.
Yep.
Uh, but you don't like hear that, so it's just it was kind of like one of those things for me. But yeah, so that's basically how that happened.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I think too, like, people probably would be really, kind of surprised to hear not only those beginnings. I mean, I obviously don't have enough knowledge on that subject of like Germany and Nazi era Germany, but like I would assume there's a lot of companies that the companies that survived probably had ties because it was a countrywide thing at some level at that era, but
Yeah,
totally assuming there. But then like as
probably
it
no way
kind
to
of,
escape it, really. I mean,
yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. That's the way I would put it. But then like as you kind of read the stories, there's people that work for the brands or family that continue to resurface throughout these stories, decades later, where it's like, well, this person is still, investing in, behind the scenes, putting their money in. I forget, was it British Knights or one of those companies, right? Where you had
yeah,
like I think like people. Like I know some of that stuff existed, but every time it would come back up, I'd be like, dang, this is another one of those examples where there's just so much, and I guess like, living in America now, it's like, yes, like the big corporate arms reach everywhere, right? But like you just
Yeah.
don't really see it in terms of the footwear industry because they've done a good job of kind of separating those things and keeping everybody at a distance. But it was just really fascinating to me. And one of the other things that I thought you did a really good job of too is just like, I guess like just the random kind of nuggets, right? Because I think there's so many things that influence like sneakers for me in like the 15 plus years that I've worked in the footwear industry and had, been creating content for myself, for other people for this long. There's always things that I can look at and think, oh, this was like an influential moment that people don't see through sneakers, but because it's such a big pop culture moment, it absolutely does influence other things that we buy as consumers, which I think, maybe talks about how you went approaching those types of things too.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, there's different levels of pop culture nuggets in the book. Like one, I every year there was a signature shoe release. I tried to have like a kind of a major event. Like just for example, like the Jack Purcell in 1935. I threw in like a paragraph about that was the year Babe Ruth retired. But then while I was writing too, I don't know. I just kind of have like a thought like, oh, wait a second. There's this weird thing that Al Bundy did that's maybe connected to this or not connected. I don't know, but it's kind of like sparked that in my mind. So, all right, I'll toss in a footnote. Um, and then just like another, just things like, I was talking about the Pistons and I remember playing, Bill Lambier's combat basketball.
Yep.
Oh, he didn't have a signature shoe, but he had this game that I remember being horrible. So I remember I Googled it and I just Googled like Bill Lambier's basketball. It, like I don't know, 10 results are like worst game ever, and I was like, yeah, that's how I remember it.
Yeah, me
And
too.
yeah, and then like um, Isaiah Thomas's mom actually lived down like kind of in my neighborhood growing up, and so we go there for Halloween, and she'd give out like Isaiah Thomas candy bars, and so I just kind of he never had a signature shoe, so I threw that in there, and I remember like when I was writing it, I looked it up on eBay, and you could still buy his candy bar on eBay. So I don't probably wouldn't recommend eating it, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's out there still.
It's like
So
it's
yeah,
like
just
the
like weird stuff like that that just jogged my memory, whatever it was, and I pretty much obsessed with pop culture, just watch tons of TV and stuff, so
yeah.
I have plenty of weird, useless knowledge.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was going to ask earlier, but you probably didn't ever plan to write a book and have, you've been, it's not useless knowledge now, right? You actually,
Right.
it
I
finally
put it
came
to some
around.
use a little bit.
Yeah. Uh, so I guess like how did you go about even like, like you mentioned, considering doing the ebook, how did that whole process of getting it published and, what was that like for you? Because I meant to ask, like, I'm assuming this is your first book.
Yeah, yeah, this is my first book, so that was kind of like the weird thing. I only approached maybe like five publishers, and they were all kind of like, "Well, what have you written before?" And I'm like, "Nothing really. Some screenplays that didn't get made, but that's about it." And then I approached Eckhart's Press in Chicago. They're kind of a small Chicago publisher. I wrote them a letter, and like right away, um, the owner, Rick Kempfer, was really into it. And he's like, "Yeah, this is awesome. There needs to be more stuff like this out there." So, yeah, he was into it, and I had already talked with several like bigger publishers that just since I didn't have any like other books to show them, basically, they weren't going to publish it, and so it kind of like I don't know, it kind of like happened a little bit easier than I thought it would, just because he was really into it. And then it's weird because I'd been at the library and I saw Rick Kempfer's book, which he wrote a book called Every Cub Ever, which is a like it's at least a paragraph on every single person that's worn a Cubs uniform from like 1870 to present.
Wow.
And he has weird little like kind of pop culture footnotes in his book, so it just kind of like worked out that it was a good fit.
Yeah, sounds like that's awesome though. I mean, I think that's like one of those things where you just kind of, you know, the kind of stars align and the synchronicity happens, and it's like,
Yeah.
wait, this actually totally makes sense that this person is really into this, and now, I mean, I guess like so the book you've was it like end of the year you got it published and out there, right? Like I think we're a few
Yeah.
months into it.
It came on like the end of November.
Okay. And I guess like what other than realizing that you have all this pop culture knowledge that now is now has a good place to live.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that like you ran into challenge wise with the book that you could learn from for the next one if you choose to go down that path again?
Um, I well on my next book, or if I had to do it again, I think I probably would have slowed down a little bit. Even though I mean, it was just such yeah, like I was just having such a blast writing it and researching this stuff. But I probably would have like taken a little more time to just kind of reflect on things a little bit before like because I as soon as I was done, I started kind of just looking for a publisher.
Yeah,
Um, like I might have kind of just like whip, put it aside maybe for a little bit, came back, revisited a little more. So I mean, I don't know if that's not really a challenge, but it's something I would have probably done different.
yeah,
Um, Yeah, I don't. The biggest challenge basically was trying to get research materials because I think the library was closed, so I was buying tons of books on Amazon or getting ebooks. And then the library opened, I remember, and I think I had like 40 books, and so some poor guy had to like carry them all to my car because I mean you couldn't go in there.
oh
So I
man,
guess
yeah.
that was a challenge, but it wasn't that bad. So, um, but yeah, I mean that was probably the biggest challenge, I guess.
So
Um,
so do you think you'll take on another one then, or
yeah, I've actually started writing kind of a weird book about baseball. The working title right now is called Baseball Cards, Food for Thought, and Other Random Tidbits. It's
nice,
basically
nice.
it's about like food issued baseball cards and stuff like that. So I'm trying to chronicle like 1950 to 2000 basically.
That'll be right up my alley too, man. I mean, we were talking before, and I'm obviously a big baseball fan, but uh, the two things that came to mind instantly when you said food for thought, Mother's Cookies out here was like a huge one.
Yeah,
All the
yeah.
Giants, I've still got like autographed Mother's Cookies cards from the early '80s, and then when
The Granny Goose chips, they did the A's, I think.
yep,
I think
yep,
they might even still do put out uh, A's cards.
yeah, and then uh, I don't know the years, but Denny's did those like hologram cards for 5 or 6 years, where you'd buy a Grand Slam and get one pack or one it wasn't even a pack, right? It's just a single card or something. And I
Yeah,
remember like just begging my grandparents to go to Denny's, which in hindsight, like I would never want to beg anyone to go to Denny's, but like when I was a kid, those cards were everything.
it was either like 93 or 97, I want to say. Or I'm sure they put them out for multiple years, but
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, those are definitely in there.
So I guess like with with the with the signature sneakers, how did you how did you know where to stop? Did you just because we talked a little bit about Jordan and after, but then like as you're writing that, were you just like, okay, you mentioned having a much bigger list when you started, and then when you get to that, did you decide on like, oh, it doesn't, we don't want it to go too long, or was it just more like there's so many signature shoes out here that if I go beyond Jordan, it might just be too much? It almost becomes an
Um,
encyclopedia at that point, right? So
yeah, I mean, it wasn't really like it never crossed my mind like I don't want it to be too long. It was more like there's literally maybe like 20 shoes coming out in a year. and it's hard to keep track of them all. And then once other sports started getting involved, and then especially once like auto racing got involved, I mean that's just getting kind of
Yeah,
weird. Um, which I mean, it's cool now kind of to look back on that. Dale Earnhardt Sr. could have a signature shoe,
yeah,
but it's just like is the way I describe it in the book is just kind of the gluttony. There was just so much. Like everyone just saw, how much money Nike was making with Jordan, and everyone's looking for that next charismatic athlete, and they'll basically, taking a chance on anybody pretty much. Like when Wayne Gretzky gets a shoe, uh,
yeah,
it's definitely getting like weird. But yeah, I don't know. I just kind of I just figured once it got to the 90s, then that was kind of a good place to hang it up for now, anyway, at least. Maybe I'll come back to it, but it was too chaotic. There's just so much going on that I felt like it was
yeah.
kind of a good place to end it.
Definitely, and I think like to kind of go a little bit further for listeners, this covers all sports basically. So it's not just basketball shoes in the '90s that blew up. Wayne Gretzky played his sport on ice skates and had a signature sneaker. Like it doesn't make sense, right? Like Dale
Yeah,
Earnhardt, as much as he was an incredible driver and huge, monumental athlete for the sport of NASCAR, you never saw his shoes until the last 5 minutes of the 3 hour race. So it's like you could really see how people were grasping to get a piece of that, energy that was out there and money that was out there with all of these shoes that, and it's, I don't know, it's fascinating too because like I feel like we sneakers kind of just went like skyrocketed in the late '80s, early '90s, and then I don't know, for better or worse, I don't know if it ever corrected itself, in terms of like just how much is out there, right? Like the consumerism part of it at this point is almost over. I mean, not almost, it absolutely is overwhelming, especially as someone who works in the industry and like, I buy my fair share of sneakers, but I can't possibly buy, if anybody's listening that has the sneakers app or the Adidas app or whatever, you're seeing like 3 to 4 shoes every other day or every 3 days,
it's
and
wild.
yeah, and like not all of those will be signature shoes, but like now you have, signet. I don't know. It's not. I guess you would consider them collaborations, but like, I think of like Virgil Abloh and Kanye West and all these people that have their own shoe lines. It's absolutely a signature shoe, but it has nothing to do with sport and the signature shoe the way it was before, right? Because it's always
Yeah,
even the way that it's written and presented to consumers, it's like Virgil Abloh X Off White Nike, X whatever, as opposed to just being like the Nike Abloh one or whatever. So
right. Yeah, you got like like uh, Bacon Air Maxes, or I think there was a Reese's shoe I saw
yep,
just the other day. But yeah, I mean, it just seemed like Run DMC and Adidas came together so organically to, work together. And obviously, Run DMC got their own signature sneaker later. But then, like, Paula Abdul got an LA Gear shoe. I think it was the Sun Blossom. And
yep,
then, um, yeah, I mean, it was just way too much. And I don't know. I think, and actually, I put this quote in my book, but another guy wrote it, Jason Coles, and he said, the sneaker wars in the 80s and 90s were kind of based on innovation. And then, I don't know, like late now, it's all uh, just based on kind of retroing older stuff. So, I mean, I thought that was like a really good way to put things. And I
yeah.
stole it from my book. So, I gave him credit though, but yeah, I just thought that was kind of the perfect way to put it.
Yeah, most definitely. That's been kind of an ongoing conversation with a handful of the folks that I am close with in the especially on the media side of like sneakers, where like Russ Bankston, this guy that wrote for Slam for years and Complex and all these places, and when I talked to him on the podcast a few months back, he referenced the guys that he looked up to, like the Bobito Garcias and that, and one of the things that was interesting was that Bobito always said that sneakers ended when like in like 85 when the Jordan came out, right? Like he lost interest at that point because it was no longer about like playing basketball and making them their own, make them the shoes your own and all that stuff. And Russ and I are about, I don't know, maybe like 7 8 years apart, but like his peak era is literally like 5 years pre my peak era of like
Yeah.
and it's kind of interesting, and I wonder how like that's going to progress too, because I think like the thing about all the stories that are in the book is that they were very much like underlying stories behind the sport, right?
Mhm.
And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing as a sports fan. I guess I should back that up. As a marketing person, as someone who works in the industry, I don't think that that's a bad thing. As a sports fan, I do think that that's a bad thing because like I miss the real deep connections with sport that happen, and um, just thinking of like Jordan, for instance, and like you mentioned having the sixes as your first shoe or first pair of Jordans, like you got to see him play, I don't know, at least 20 or 30 games in that specific colorway or whatever, and that's what
Right.
made it so special. Right now, I don't know if there's a way for people to keep up with it other than like by placing a monetary value on it on the secondary market, and oh, that's why this shoe is important, which doesn't seem like a sustainable thing for the business side of footwear in any way, shape, or form. Especially as you said, like everything has kind of come back to this, retro stuff, right? And
Mhm.
but I also do think that like a lot of the retro product outside of the Nike and maybe the Adidas stuff, there's a lot of opportunity for the other brands to kind of get creative with like, there's, I mean, even going back to like George Mikan and the Pro Kids, right? Like, or actually you mentioned, the Sandlot, right? Like that's a great shoe where
Yep.
like, hey, they actually did, kind of bring back that story and tell that story again, and it wasn't about the original release of the shoe. It was about, hey, this became an iconic shoe because of this movie and the pop culture element. I think that's going to be an interesting kind of thing for me to watch, at least as a fan of both pop culture and sneakers, to like see how these things kind of get, revisited throughout the next, couple of decades. Because, with sport, it's always easy to go back and kind of reminisce with the nuances that exist now and the like, just this sheer massive amount of stuff that's out there. Almost nobody's going to remember most of these things. So
Yeah, it's
I don't
kind of
know.
like, you know, if you, it's kind of like if you they say if you like if you go if you're presented with too many options, you like almost you usually don't like get anything. You know what I mean? Like if you go to a supermarket and there's 50 different kinds of ketchup, for example, you're most likely gonna or the average person will probably just won't get any and just walk away. Where if you have
Yep.
like maybe three choices, then you get something. And it's probably a poor example, but anyway, you know what I mean. But
Yeah.
I think it'd be interesting too. How far do you think Air Jordans can go?
That's a crazy kind of debate in itself. I think a lot of the sneaker like enthusiast community thought it should have ended at 23.
Yeah,
It would have been a good, you know, ending point. Um, because it creates its own problem when it's Michael Jordan's shoe, right? Because like Jordan Brand now has Luca and Zion, and like those guys deserve to potentially have their own shoe, right? And
right,
if Jordan's name is still attached to it, or there's like Zion, for instance, arguably the best player in the league, in the next 5 10 years, right? If everything goes as planned, I think, or as expected for him. But now, because he's a part of Jordan Brand, he'll have a shoe that has to be second to the Air Jordan signature model, which
yeah,
just
it's
doesn't make
weird.
sense. And you know, I, I mean, we've moved a long way from like the performance side selling Jordans because we've gone so far into retros. But I think at some point, like you've got to step back and look at that as Nike and Jordan or any of the brands that have signature athletes and think how much of the how much of this do we have to pay attention to for the second and third times around, right? Because look, LeBron's still playing, and we're now getting LeBron retros on a regular basis,
Yeah.
and I mean, I remember, you probably do as well. Like when Michael, decided to play baseball, I was kind of ecstatic because I just like, wow, this is great. He's the best at basketball. If he can do this at baseball, this is going to be amazing. But that also was the start of retros, right? Like 94 was the first time that they were like, oh, well, Michael's no longer playing. Let's crank out these like, nostalgia products and sell those. It was exciting as a kid. I didn't get them back then because I just didn't have the money. I had just
Yeah.
started working at, 13, 14 years old, and like those were still unattainable for me. But the excitement was there because it was me being able to kind of revisit those days of not being able to afford them. And yet we just won't have any of those moments now because everything is compounded, right? Like uh, a good example of this is like I'm sure you saw you know the NBA guys that were playing in the Kobe Grinch shoe
Yeah.
for the last couple of months, right? And that's such an odd shoe. I mean, they all grew up watching Kobe. They saw him play on Christmas Day. Of course, they want to play in that shoe. But now what happens? Like, it's nothing against like a guy like DeMar DeRozan, but like I'm not going to have a memory of DeMar DeRozan playing in a Kobe shoe to get me to buy that shoe 10 years from now, right? So that part of it is
Yeah.
really fascinating. I think the Jordan model as a pinnacle shoe could go on, forever if they wanted it to. But I think that it's not fair to the best athletes in the league right now to step into those shoes, both physically and metaphorically, right? Because you
Right.
can't possibly live up to being Jordan. You shouldn't try to be Jordan. You should try to be, your own version of Jordan, whatever that is for you as an athlete. But like then having that as the constant thing, I think, you know, and I don't know, maybe you could talk to this a little bit. Like with D Wade, for instance, signed with Jordan Brand for a few years, and then you know found that he could get equity in leaning and a lot more opportunity. So kind of did the unthinkable and gave up the being a Chicago guy, looking up to Jordan, getting to wear Jordans and be signed by Jordan Brand and all that, and then kind of moves into this new space with Li Ning and has been really successful at it. Like has I mean actually more signature shoes with Li Ning that I can actually count in my head right now. But like that's an interesting kind of
It's kind of
you know
yeah. It's a weird thing, definitely. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just I think at a certain point too. I mean, Jordan's not going to be forgotten, but at a certain point, like you know, kids aren't going to kind of connect with Jordan.
yeah
Um, so, and they're the ones. I mean, primarily probably driving interest, I would think. Although, who knows? I mean, obviously, people in their 30s who watch Jordan or whatever too drive the
yeah
market. But um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I really hadn't thought about it until now, and I was like, you know what? I want to ask Nick about this one.
yeah
Um,
it'll be interesting. I mean I think that Jordan was obviously an anomaly, and like even like going back to like all the athletes that you have in the book, right? Like it's not that they weren't a big deal and incredible athletes, but like in terms of like taking it from being sports or a sport and then turning it into like a pop culture revolution, we just won't see that ever again. And it's kind of just really incredible to think about that, I guess.
yeah.
But
One thing
so
I've like, so
go
I was
ahead.
just gonna say real quick. I don't know if you watch much golf, but it's like all the golf pros now are like wearing like Jordan 11s. Like they have
Yep.
Jordan 11 spikes. Like there's like Pat Perez and Keegan Bradley and
Yep.
Harold Varner. They're all like huge into like wearing Jordans, which is it's kind of a cool look for the golf course. So
Yeah,
that's cool.
definitely. I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to kind of keep an eye on, right? Like golf is a so it's not out yet, but one of the last conversations I had was with a friend of mine, Andrew, who is like a massive tennis fan, massive tennis shoe collector, right? He's
Mhm.
big Agassi fan, and like obviously Agassi was like nothing like tennis had ever seen, right? Like that was the appeal. Was he was like this rock star rebel anomaly in this world of
Canon
button up.
Rebel, yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but he was like totally, surrounded by, I think like what you would traditionally think of as suits, and like white, all white, polos and all that stuff. And golf is like is right there on the cusp of that, right? Like
yeah. They're
it will,
both country club sports.
yeah. So I think like we're getting to the point with golf where there's a lot more energy with the youthful guys, and there's a lot more like finding ways to like have that Jordans on the feet or whatever that is that allows you to be a little bit have a little bit more personality showing. But I
Right.
also think we're golf is probably ready for one of those people that like gets kicked off the course instead of finishes, right? And
Exactly. Yeah, they're ready for the next John Daly. It's been a while, so
yeah, exactly,
need
yeah.
someone like
So
him.
yep. But so I wanted to circle back to like and as we wrap up here, one of the things I try to do with this podcast is at least give people insight on like what they're if they're listening to this and saying, hey, I want to write a book, or a book about sneakers even, you know what can they do to kind of learn from some of the challenges. So what would be a piece of advice you would give to a young writer who wants to take on this kind of challenge of writing a book about sneakers or signature sneakers or just sports in general?
Um, I think, you know, if I had to do it again, I probably would have sat down and kind of just picked the brain of someone who's written a book before. I kind of just jumped on there, just started like going rogue and doing my own thing. I think it would have helped a lot to sit down with, and it doesn't have to be about sneakers or sports, but just someone that's written a book in general. And uh, yeah, for anyone looking to write a book or kids out there, I think that's probably the best way to go about it. Um, just to have some insight, on what you might face. Um, but yeah, I think that's probably it.
Cool, man. Well, I'll throw this up here again. Signature shoes, the athletes who wore them, and delightful pop culture nuggets.
Um,
I guess,
the main place you can get it is
yeah.
eckhartzpress.com. That's ECKHARTZ press.com. Mainly only available there, just largely because of the pandemic right now. So, but who knows what the future will hold.
Cool, cool. And I guess too, like where can people connect with you if they want to follow you on social media and such?
You can find me on Instagram at the old chap collectibles OLE, um, or Twitter. I think my username is Trembath underscore Ryan. So those are the main places you can connect with me if you ever want to chat.
Cool. Well, I'll make sure there's links to everything in the description wherever you're watching this, listening to this. Thanks for spending an hour with me, Ryan, and chatting. This has been a blast for me.
Yeah, thanks,
I
Mike. I
really did.
appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, I really did enjoy it. It was definitely a good vacation for me from the normal stuff that I'm reading to. So um,
Nice.
definitely highly suggested. I would think that this would be an enjoyable read for anybody that's into sneakers or sports. So um,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks again for coming on. Thank you everybody for tuning in, for watching. We'll catch you on the next one. Peace.